right, this is Moore with Irida TV, and I have two wonderful women sitting here with me that have come to talk about a subject that is lacking from your public school education, which, I mean, that's not saying much. I think everything's lacking from the public school education at this point, but specifically, we are going to be talking about some Western and possibly even classical civilization, and how do we start incorporating that, and why is it important to get it back into the minds of children? Do I have that right? I mean, is that kind of a
absolutely
broad scope of it? So I have Lynn, Trinh with me on this side. I've got Streit with me over on this side, and this is a recent organization you've created, right? The Classical Scholars.
Yes, very recent. I would just say a couple months ago. So we're very excited about it taking off.
Got it. Well, in order for me to stop putting words into your guys' mouths, what's the purpose of Classical Scholars?
Well, we would like to think that we're helping our families and our young generation in a way that will help them to revisit what our legacy was. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we want to tie everything from history of Western civilization to our modern issues and our own country, which we think, both Ann and I, we believe that has been deviated away from school teaching and just society learning, and a lot of times even deviated from the facts. So we want to come back not only to renew some of the facts of our own country and feel prideful about them, but also from learning history, Ann and I, we both see a lot of benefits for a young generation to grow and into their future. So.
I want to address that because I remember being in school, which was pretty bad, but I don't think it's as bad. It was as bad as it is now, but I hated history. I despised history, and when I went to college, I made sure I never took a history class in college because I hated it so much because I couldn't figure out, why are we learning this? Why are we learning this? And, they all got their good answers, but the way that they taught it wasn't very congruent with, with how they answered. So what I realized is after I started reading history, I would say, in quotes, that mattered, and I can talk more about what exactly that means, is that you recognize that as an individual in a society or an individual in a civilization, you've inherited a lot of tools. I mean, if just to give like the concrete example, right, is maybe like the road outside that we drove on to get here, I personally didn't build that, right? That was something that I got to inherit. Well, same thing with my language. I didn't make the English language. I inherited that. I mean, maybe, I'm one speck that kind of molds it as it continues to move forward, but I didn't make the English language. I didn't create the system of government. I didn't create the system of values. These are all things that I inherited. So if I'm going to have these inherited tools, I realize it's important for me to know what's this tool supposed to do? How is it functioning? What was it originally supposed to do? What's it doing now? Do we want it to do the thing that it was doing originally? Do we want to do something different now? Do we need to get rid of it? I mean, in order for us to even have that conversation, we have to have some sort of historical background of what are we working with? And if, when I was in school, we still got a smattering of like, here's the West and here's where it came from and that sort of thing. My understanding now is just like, the West is bad, slaves, colonization, West, bad, slaves, killed everybody, smallpox blankets, and diversity, good, slaves, bad. I mean, from my understanding, that's all you get in a public school these days. So from what you two are trying to do, correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we reinject that back into the minds of people who are going to grow up in the society so they can use the tools that they inherited with some degree of proficiency?
Wow, that is really good question. I'm going to take part of that question because I think Ann is, I'll talk about my personal experience, how I lost my identity when I grew up in actually Cultural Revolution in China. So I was about the fun. Sorry for being that was sarcastic. About the age, our campers age group, early teens. We were banned from cultures, history, religion, and just everyday life, there was only one linear path. That is to learn about our Communist Party. We didn't have to care about what our parents thought. We just had to listen to the teachers who I now realize they were just advocate of our Communist Party. So everything is driving us to that direction. None of the things that from the past mattered to the school to teach us. So I feel like I just didn't even have my own identity. And I think that's the number one thing that a person who feels valuable about his and herself should have. Where are you coming from, and what makes you a person as a whole? And how do you relate to your immediate environment or to the world from that aspect? We were not even allowed to learn anything from our own culture. So we were basically being banned from all that. So when I moved here with my family, I was about 14. And then I just find this fascinating new world of America, so much freedom and anything you want to learn. And I became very interested in architecture. And what is fascinating about learning architecture is we get to learn all these wonderful buildings from the Western civilization, from worldwide. But really, what's intrigued me is the cultures and history behind those buildings, and that is when I realized how much I have lost from my experience of the youth, and what I'm seeing in today's society with our own kids when they're banned from all these important, valuable knowledge about the past.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. When you say what you lost as a youth, you're referring specifically to the Chinese culture
Yeah.
that you grew up in.
Exactly.
Right? You got, by contrast, you were able to see this is what was taken away from me.
Exactly. And I see no past, I see no present, I see no future, because I basically didn't have my self-identity. So very much I want to become American. And I was fascinating to go through the learning process of the Western civilizations, history and culture, and how intimately the buildings were congruent in a way, become part of that. And I just feel so much richness. So I decided that I wanted to go back and kind of fill in the pieces from my own culture. So I picked a very traditional project as my thesis in architecture school and learned about the courtyard compound that we have in China. And from there, I went thousands of years back in learning from philosophy to religion to cultures and different historical events. And I feel like that project brought me back to where I feel like I'm a prideful person. I can say that I have a lineage of the Chinese history. And through that, I also learned how to value things, how to look at things critically, how to compare the different world cultures. And that really enriched my life. But even still at that time frame, I was still feeling, the world is a wonderful place. Not until recently, I really started to think my earlier experience of the lacking of learning history and culture it's going to be implemented into our generation here, which I would never think about. And that's probably the second component why that driving me to have this program available for the kids here, because I can foresee their future from my past with this lacking of information and taking the tools away from learning and becoming a holistic person. So, and I hope that started to answer some of your questions. How I personally experience this is very important. And then when I started to have family, I stopped my career as architect, and then I started to volunteer to teach classic Chinese literature to young kids. And I encourage them to basically be familiar with where their roots are and have a strong identity of who they are, even though we're part of this new world in America, but they should always know their origin. And also, I didn't realize this until now, more and more evident to me is that the more they learn from history, not just the eloquent words or incisive phrases, but really the stories from the history, I feel like start to teach them values.
And are we talking about Chinese, Western, or just in general?
Well, this is my experience from teaching classic Chinese literature. Yeah, my job in the school is to teach them poetry, philosophies from Confucius, all the classic history and literatures. And because they're so young, we start at 3 years old, but ultimately, the literatures we pick are classical because they teach good values, but then they also fitting into the format where the kids can read them and be very, like with rhymes and things. It's very easy for them to recite. It's almost like singing a song, but the messages surface later. So I follow the same group of kids from 3 years old all the way until now they're about 12, 13. And they start to come to me and share with their class, like some of the phrases they learned from Confucius has come to life because the value embedded in these words has helped them to make good decisions and help them to become compassionate and realizing some of the virtues to become a good person. And sometimes realize that, how they can become a good member of a society. So I feel so rewarded seeing that process of their learning and seeing on contract the recent years how our school, just majority of the schools here have degraded from taking that valuable teaching away from our kids. So then I become worried because like I said, my personal experience tells me this is not something that they can do without, as a person. So, and then I become very active in the community, to promote good education and try to encourage parents to get more involved with school and with policies. And I got to know a great reading group like Anne, where as a parent, we read about the real American history, which is very different from what my kids are learning. And we become a really good group, talk about, how history can impact not just kids, but in general, right? And then we decided, okay, so we could work on the policies, so we can encourage our community to have these good leaders to get involved. But ultimately, we need to help our kids. In the meantime, they're not getting these good information or even factual information. This is probably the biggest motivation that we have, all the way. I would say the long version is from my personal experience, but then the short version is in the recent years. This is very urgent. I almost call it intellectual and moral poverty that our kids are experiencing. So
Absolutely.
We're here to fill the gap. And Anne has a lot of good experience, so I might have her help me to fill in like some of the ideas we have to run these classes. Because your good question is about how do we get kids or anybody to even want to learn history, because they're just dry, numbers and events. But from teaching for almost 12 years, classical, and also just over the recent years of pandemics, we become very creative in how to engage kids. And we have experience in what intrigues them to learn. So I guess at some point I would love for Anne, because she is kind of our curriculum teacher, and I think she has fabulous ideas to engage our kids to kind of finish this path. And when they're done, we're hoping that, at the end of the camp, we're hoping that they grasp all these important historical characters and meeting these giants. But we really hope that this will serve as a seedling, and so they will sprout into something they will always carry with them. Yeah.
And so this specifically, this isn't like, sign up to our online course. This is a camp you're showing up to say,
yes,
this is going to be a full-on, presume a week or part of a week
Yeah,
or something like that. Like for the days that you're going to be here, we're going to be focused on this. It's not going to be some slice of your day where you're focused on that and, okay, focus on this for an hour and then go back to what you were doing, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be a full-on experience.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because there's actually some really good programs out there that kids can learn from online. But what we are eager to engage the kids in is interactions with us, with each other, and project-driven, story-driven, because we think that's the best way for them to interpret, what they're learning. And having a group discussion with their peers, I seen fabulous result just from online teaching, that they learn the most from each other. And I learn from them because their discussion becomes so alive. It's much more, I think, engaging in terms of learning credibilities when we put it in the interactive way. And there's no limit of how we see our program. Our vision is really beyond the summer camp. It just because we're so recent, so we're in time for summer. Yeah. But we really wanted to work with any school program that we could incorporate this aspect of learning. So we will work with anybody, but our format will always be interactive, in person. That's what we see our advantages for the community here. And then, of course, they're always welcome to be fulfilled with other resources online, but this is what we think that we offer that would really benefit the kids.
Absolutely. I had a reaction to that. Was something else you wanted to add before I do, Anne?
I've got a couple things to say, so if you've got a quick one, go ahead. Or...
it won't be quick. Okay. I'm never
Neither am I.
So before I respond to that, was there something that you wanted to add?
Well, I do. Lynn did a beautiful job of explaining the importance of history. And I just wanted to say, she talked about her experiences with the Cultural Revolution. And Mao, part of that was getting rid of the four olds. It's old traditions and old history. She could expand on that, certainly. But that theme has gone throughout modern history as well. Mark said, give me, if you take away a person's heritage, they are easily persuadable.
Keep talking.
Okay. Lenin said, give me 4 years with a child and I'll have them forever. So the purpose is to take away our history. And one of the things that they have been doing for a long time is making history, to your point, boring. It is a series of dates and wars and names that you remember for a test, and then it's over.
Right, and then it was July 4th, not July 3rd, so you get the answer wrong. Right?
Yeah.
How does that help me understand the principles of what
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to do, is we're looking at principles. History is actually fascinating. It's a story of great men and women, civilizations, inventions, successes and catastrophes. And it's absolutely so exciting, and it tells us who we are. Lynn mentioned her interest in architecture. If you don't understand architecture and you look at Washington, D.C., and you think, why does Washington, D.C. look like that? It's because they took from Greeks and Roman architecture. And our kids aren't learning. John Dos Passos did a wonderful essay. He's an American novelist, and he talks about how in good times, easy times, history is just an ornamental art, and you can get away with that kind of stuff. But in times of trouble, it's important for us to be able to look back at our history and understand what happened before so that we can unravel the mysteries and the riddles and how do we get there, because everybody here knows that saying that history doesn't rhyme, but it repeats.
Or it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Yes,
yes,
doesn't
okay.
repeat, but it rhymes. Thank you for that. And and if you want to understand what's going on, you have to know history, or you'll repeat it. So it is important for our kids to know history, but we want to make it come alive. So many of the textbooks are broken up into, they don't tell a narrative, they don't tell a story. It'll be a little box on the weapons. It'll
keep talking. I'm going to see if I can find a spot.
But if you can find a good history book, it's a narrative of how things worked, how they went together, how they influenced each other. And that's what we're trying to do, is make history come alive for the kids, to make it fun, which is what it should be.
I don't think I'm going to find it in time. I'm holding The Evolution of Civilizations. Anyone who watches the show knows we're pretty much reaching for this book every other show, particularly if we're talking about history. But this is written by Carol Quigley. I talked to you weren't familiar with the name. Does the name Carol Quigley mean anything to you?
No.
Okay, he wrote another book called Tragedy and Hope, which is the one he's more famous for. It's this 1,300-page book with words this tiny and no margins, I mean, it's good, but be prepared for a slog to get through that one. And a lot of conspiracy-minded people look to it to say, okay, here's the proof that there's a conspiracy going on, because on page 950 he admits to the conspiracy, and he was supposedly the private historian to the Council on Foreign Relations and had access to historical materials that a normal historian wouldn't have access to. Now, I'm not addressing all that. I want to address this book because I think it's the better of the two books. Because in here, he actually hypothesizes a scientific way of understanding history. And I want to get to the point that you both brought, I mean, all three of us brought it up, but the names and dates thing is, he says, so there's an infinite number of facts in this room right now. We could search out facts forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and never stop. And if we only have a bunch of facts, we're not able to do anything with it. We have to draw understanding from these facts. And he said there's a group of historians that, or I think he said most historians, that's the part I was trying to find. Most historians, either they don't try to do this or they say that it can't happen. And he makes a quip in there, as he said, you know, they say that it can't happen, but somehow they continue to be historians, and I don't really, I don't really understand how that works. But he says there's got to be a way for us to say, okay, at some point, we have to say we got enough facts for us to move on to the next step, which is understanding. And if the historian is simply in this mode of collecting facts, he becomes clerical. He you know, he's just the, you know, at the doctor's office, the person who writes it down and sticks your well, it's all electronic now, but you guys know what I'm talking about. Remember the doctor's office, they had the whole big wall of files in the back. So he said, I want to make historians to be executives, where we can say, okay, we understand the principles, we understand, okay, from these facts, we're able to determine this principle. So when we go into something new, we're looking at, okay, you know, why do you learn history? Because it you know, it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But so if you don't know your history, you're going to be blindsided. Well, what exactly does that look like? Well, it looks like if we understand what facts to take, how to identify those facts, how to extrapolate understanding, and then we can say, okay, what are we in now? We should be able to make some sort of prediction what's going to happen based on the fact that there's these principles that we know out of history. And I mean, maybe we'll get into that later in the conversation of what those principles are. But when you start talking about history that way, for example, one of the things he's famous for, this is on page 34, right at the beginning of Tragedy and Hope, is he says that the only time in history where you have societies that experience relative freedom is when the general populace has access to weapons that are the same that the military uses. Yeah. I never learned that in school. And the American Revolution was one of the rare times in history where that was actually the case. Like, I mean, the whole philosophy and Enlightenment and all that sort of stuff wouldn't have mattered if the general population didn't have the same access to weaponry that the military did. I think he said that Athens, Greece, classical times is another example of when this happened, when you see like the democratic push, where the masses are able to push back against the people that the military that typically have specialized weapon. And an example of a specialized weapon in Western history would be like the knight on horseback. So in medieval times, there was two military units, the knight on horseback and the castle. Well, obviously the castle can't beat the knight on horseback, and for most purposes, the knight on horseback can't beat the castle. And it has to do with the fact that horses compete directly for human beings for food. And at the time, with the technology, it took about 50 to 100 people working on food to support one mounted knight on horseback. So this is clearly a very, very specialized weapon. And if you know anything from history, the knights they'd train like 8 hours a day. Just fighting. It's all they did. And that if you wanted to conquer a neighboring castle, well, you required fealty from your vassals, and your vassals owed you, 40 days a year or something as part of their fealty to you. And 40 days isn't enough to put a siege on a castle. so no one could really conquer each other in that period, and it wasn't until pikemen started getting involved, started coming around that we have a relatively cheaper weapon that can interact with a knight on horseback and get the people off the horse, and then after it's muskets, then guns and cannons and all that sort of stuff. But that was just what I described right there is fascinating.
Yes,
that's a completely different. Now this happened on this date, and this happened on this date. And then this happened, and then this person, and are you taking notes? You better remember these dates, right? Because these dates are going to be on the. I mean, it's just a completely different conversation. Because with what I just talked about, I mean, I talked about food. How many, what does it take to support someone with a weapon? What do the people with the weapons do, and what are the defenses, and how does that change? And then there's the social structure of, here's how I get the military, and that changes how. Whoa. This is all interconnected, and now I can make predictions based off these principles that I'm talking about. So, I think what you guys are telling me is you want to be a little bit more like that, and less like and here's the date that this happened, and then here's the date that this happened, and this person did this. Am I far off the mark here?
No, you've nailed it exactly.
Yeah.
That this is a human story. People were affected by this. It's this person conquered this civilization, conquered this one, that conquered this one, and you never understand why they switched from weapons to weapons, and what it was like for the real people, what it was like for the children to live in those days. It's boring what we're teaching is just paper history,
right? And
what we want to teach, and what is fascinating to you is live history. What really happened? These were real people, not just figures on paper. And that's what we're trying to do.
That's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, the way Dylan described it is so much, it just came alive, even, even like
I'm
here.
just repeating what I read in this book.
Yeah.
No, but the depth of that kind of history interaction, though, I think it's much more likely to stay with the person, and much more likely to challenge that person to think critically from all dimensions. You mentioned, not just test-taking numbers, but from all these aspects of what happened in that different scales, from individual to like army to society, and how other people were impacted. There's a lot also of moral values in them.
Right.
Like, how do you judge a win from a loss? Someone's win might be somebody's terrible loss. So how do you elevate yourself from a different platform, looking down at things, not just from one perspective? I think that is what is challenging our kids and to many other people as well right now. When we are programmed to believe in one way of linear thinking, we forget to take ourselves out to a higher elevation and looking back down and analyze and research what is being told to us and what are the facts. And that's something that we want our kids also to gain from this kind of learning. It's that it's a complexity that they need to involve themselves in, but have a logic and have, many times a compassion about what is truly happened, what is perceived of what happened, what is your view and your critical and independent thinking of what happened, and what are some of the resolutions. It's just so fascinating. Every story, the one you told is so dynamic. I love it. But there's so many stories like that. We can engage them in a similar learning process. And that's what's exciting for me and Anne, is to see them getting it and getting involved in a very intellectual level and then be their own thinker. They own it. They're not being told, but they own what they learn. And again, I see that as a little toolbox that they can tuck away for future learning. And I keep reminding myself that how important it is, even though we're doing a camp, maybe hopefully we have 10 or 12 kids involved, but we're really building a building block for a better society. If we could get these 12 kids to think like historians and be a scholar of history, then we think they're getting much more than just the dates and events. They're going to be so more equipped in everything else they face in their future. Especially, I think, in the crisis time right now. I call it crisis time. I really believe we are, because I see from what I experienced in the past, it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't prepare them, we're going to lose our next generation. We're going to...
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the your background being Chinese because and growing up in the Cultural Revolution, because I mean the first thought is like, okay, here's this Chinese woman coming telling me about Western. I'm from China. Let me teach you about Western civilization. What? But so you got to see what and you experienced what it was like to have that void there. And when you were there, you weren't even aware of it, right? Because that was forced on you, and you had to come here to see that contrast, right? And then if I'm putting words in your mouth, please correct me, but you get the impetus to say, I want to look back at my culture. I want to look back at where this came from. And then you felt what it was like to have that void filled. Mm-hmm. Now you live in the West, and you're obviously interested in the Western culture, the Western civilization, and you're seeing that what you experienced, the way they're doing it's a little different, but the outcome appears to be the same, which is put that same void in the kids.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And you guys want to be able to fill that void back up. Because if we don't have that there, I mean, I'm just kind of alluding back to what I said at the beginning, is that you're working with all these tools. You don't know what they are. You don't know where they came from. You don't know what they do. You don't know what they're supposed to do. You don't have any idea, right? I mean, you even brought up logic and critical thinking. I mean, let's pit civilization versus civilization here right now. The formal logic ultimately comes from Aristotle, right? And it was really refined, I would say, in the medieval scholastic period, from my understanding of the evolution of this. And it was from that refinement that we started getting, okay, what is science? What is the scientific method? That's all West. That's entirely the West. Right. There were other civilizations that did that. For most other civilizations, it's we're in charge and you do what we say, and here are the values. But there's part of those values aren't, well, let's critically think about those values, and does that make sense? And are you serving yourself the best way you can serve yourself? No. The values say you serve what the society tells you you're supposed to serve, and it's usually not anything to do with yourself. I mean, I guess unless you're high enough up in the hierarchy, like in say Roman times, or I mean even the whole classical world. I mean, it was mostly slaves and not slaves, right? I mean, something like when Greece was at its height in the classical civilizations, like 60% of the population were slaves. It's like, we have all this freedom and we're a democracy. If you're in the club, if you're not, you're a slave, and so sorry that it's you. So going back to the void that these kids have about Western the civilization that they're in, which is Western civilization, which I think is unique amongst the civilizations for a variety of reasons we can get into if we have time or not. But critical thinking is one of those. And it's interesting to me how much stuff we take for granted in a civilization, even if we scorn it. So, for example, I know one of the big things that's scorned right now is Christian religion, whatever flavor it is, right? And what are some of the things that came from the Christian religion? Well, monogamy, right? For most cultures around the world, it's I can get as many wives as I can afford, or I can conquer and you steal from my neighbor or whatever, right? No slavery, so slavery being bad, and I understand there was a fight throughout Western civilization for this, but no other civilization fought for the idea that slavery is bad. They all just assumed it was a natural part of the order, right? That the individual has any sort of importance at all is a very Christian idea, right? So let's just take those three. I can go on. And then we come to the modern day and say, okay, well, I'm some Marxist punk in school that has this void. And, I think Christianity is this radical form of oppression, and then we need to do everything that we can against it. but I don't question monogamy. I don't question that I have value as an individual. What was the third thing I said? I brought up slavery. I just make the assumption that slavery is bad. Yeah, those are all things that you got from Western civilization thinking.
Yes.
Those are all things that came out that were a result of Christianity. And to realize that, I mean, even for myself, because I got going through school, I got a flavor of what they're going through today. I mean, it wasn't that. I feel now that the entire curriculum is around like diversity, equity, inclusion, and white people are bad, and slavery is bad, and you're slavery. Like the whole thing is about that. For when I was there, it was kind of like sprinkled in on history classes and stuff. But even still, I emerged from the school system thinking that Western civilization was bad. And when I got this information, some of it I'm spewing out now, I'm going, oh man, I've got something that nobody else has had. For most of human history.
Yeah.
And I'm squandering it. So maybe that's not a good idea. So to say, okay, let's fill that void for these kids, because to your point, if losing the next generation, these are tools. These are, I keep using the term tools, but these are cultural identity that I think you can argue is objectively better than a lot of cultural identities have been around the world throughout history. You've got it now, and it's slipping away, and you don't even know it.
That's so true.
Yeah.
What you said, just explain how you experience that your additional learning from school. I just feel how rare is that. I mean, how many kids nowadays will pick up something, they will consider very valuable to add on to their learning. Because right now, when you compare, the Western civilization, all these Christianity, slavery, and just the individuals, how they respect their society. But in Chinese philosophy, even back in the Confucius, it's about individual family value and how you contribute to family.
Right.
And that was, again, I keep saying how that is some fundamental unit of a better society. Mm-hmm. And the social order was very important to Confucius. And I was just thinking how, even though we kind of have a different focus on different values from tradition. But
are you comparing Chinese to Western?
I was just thinking because when we learned, when we were working with the kids with the classical Chinese values, and these are the things they must respect their parents, they must respect their family, and they contribute in ways that at the time society works. And compared to slavery, say from the Western civilization, it was never considered like it's a, the way that we kept twisted into the kids thinking right now. And there are two things happening as I can see. They're destroying the family core value in this society. And that is, again, to us is very fundamental because that's a building block. And the slavery story has twisted so much that kids start to think, well, we came really bad from a really bad history. I should be shamed.
Right.
That's exactly how I experienced in China. We were put in shame of the things that.
Oh, that's interesting. That the Chinese history that you inherited, you should be ashamed of that.
It's all fake news now. Now I look back, it's all disinformation, what we learned. The only thing that we learned on history about Chinese history, they don't teach us world history. The Chinese history was all twisted. And again, everything's to gear toward glorify the Communist Party and their accomplishment. So back to slavery, because we need to relate to the Western civilization. I thought Anne has a fabulous idea about how to help our kids, not to tell them slavery is not what they tell you, but to have them go through the thinking process by introducing what was slavery like in Roman time, and then throughout the timeline and what happened even as many people claim on our curriculum that our founding father were, these dark figures about slavery, but they don't talk about the wisdom they put in the Constitution and how that had to drive, say, Martin Luther King to challenge, our equal rights to match up our Constitution. They don't talk about that standard. So I thought, the way that Ann and I, we've been thinking very hard about how do we put the curriculum together. So it's not what we're telling the kids to believe. It's how they, through history, and see how these things come about, and take a look at what is factual and what's been distorted, and make their own decisions. So that's kind of, building on what's been perceived, and then but use their own ability, and hopefully we can guide them through that process. So we're just thinking, even at this age, they're so capable.
And at what ages are you targeting, by the way?
Oh, so our first camp, we're just thinking from 10 to 15, which is kind of enough to be independent, and kind of we could work with their
we can get a little
level.
more complex than
Yeah,
with a 7-year-old, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's that. Slavery is one thing, and then we're building on other things. So each I would say topic, we wanted to have them go through the learning process. So actually building the curriculum, it's challenging. Probably the most challenging part is how do we narrow it down, right? Because we want to give them so much. There's so much to learn. And then we wanted to make it interactive and engaging, and ultimately independent to flourish in the end. So they have to earn their understanding, not being told what was learned. So I don't know if, and you want anything to add, like some of the great curriculum you thought about and how to link that into our Constitution.
Tell us about the curriculum.
The curriculum, okay. But it's such a big topic. So too many of our kids, like she said, are not learning the facts. There's a college professor that checks with his incoming freshmen, where was slavery invented? 75% of them think it was invented in America. And we're going to be going back and talking about, we're going to talk about the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Egyptians. How do you think
Everywhere always was slavery except the West.
Exactly. we're the ones that ended it.
Yeah.
But, you see the man on the street interviews and the college students that go, well, we got our independence in the 1960s from Korea. And the Civil War was fought between France and Germany.
Right.
I mean, this is what happens when all you do is teach meaningless dates. So we're going to go back and we're going to talk about what did we actually get from these civilizations, because it is too big of in a week we're not going to be able to talk about everything in Western civilizations, but we're going to talk about, what did we get from the Sumerians? Where did the idea that men and women were equal come from? Where was rule of law first established? We're going to be talking about those kind of things. Is what did we get as Americans? What do you enjoy as an American child? That and where did it come from? Our founding fathers. When I first read about this, I was a little disappointed because I thought, well, they invented this really great thing called democracy, because that's what I thought it was back then.
Yeah.
It's not. It's constitutional republic, but they studied history. They knew Cato and Cicero and Plutarch. They knew what worked and what didn't work. They hated democracy. They totally rejected it, gave us a constitutional republic. They knew what worked, and that's what we're trying to teach kids is what has history given us, where has it fallen short, what caused these civilizations to fall, and how do we make sure that our civilization doesn't fall. So, we're going to have a lot of fun, I think.
That does sound like a lot of fun. I had several questions that came up to me at once. My mind's going blank. If you got something to follow up with that, go ahead. Did I want to talk about slavery, or did I want to talk about civilizations falling, or did I want to talk about the process of civilization? The Founding Fathers, I think, is a very, very interesting topic, because we talked about slavery, we went over to the Founding Fathers, and I feel like we're going to dive more into the details now as this conversation goes about that actual history. Can have more of a discussion about the history. Is when it comes to slavery, because I mean, to your point, America invented slavery seems to be the idea that everybody gets.
Yeah.
And when the reality is Western civilization ended slavery, America was late to the party, right? Yes, granted, it was bad. It was horrible how they were treated. And America was late to the game because, most of Europe was ending slavery. And England was out, ending it in Middle Eastern countries and in Africa and in Asia and attacking slave ships that are marauding around. And America was late to that. That is completely true. However, what's interesting is that the Southern push to defend slavery only came from the fact that it was attacked in the first place. In most of the rest of the world, you didn't have to defend slavery. It was just assumed, right? And so, unfortunately, and I mean, I don't know how much of this is economic, I don't know how much of this is cultural, but in that corner of the globe, which is the southern United States before the Civil War, slavery was really important economically. And I mean, there was also this social fear of that. There was a lot of people who were against slavery, but they're like, what are we going to do? Just turn them out? Okay, slavery's over. Go be successful. People who have never been free in their life to make their own decision, and they get whipped if they say anything that appears to be challenging, right? Yeah, just go be successful. You're free now. They're like, well, obviously that's not going to work, and that's what ended up happening with the Emancipation Proclamation after the Civil War. But they said, well, how do we make this happen where we want slavery to end, but we can't just flip a switch because there'd be chaos, which isn't going to help the situation. So it's unfortunate that there's this slowdown of, okay, we've got this Declaration of Independence, we got this Constitution, all men are created equal. All men are endowed by, what the heck is it?
By their creator.
With certain enablement, right? Okay, all men are created equal. We'll just leave it at that, right? But you still have slavery, so which one is it? So there's a standard America is held to, the West is held to in general, but America specifically, that, hey, these are your standards, and you didn't meet them, which is true. But we're the only ones with those standards. Right? The fact that we even have them in the first place is head and shoulders above everybody else. Well, and to turn around and flip that and just be like, America invented slavery bad, America, slavery, America, blah, blah, blah. It's just this annoying, I mean, it's a weapon, is what it is, but it's just this annoying weapon that has to be dealt with.
And the statement that you said, from the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of people say, well, we're hypocritical. We say all men are created equal, but we have slavery. But that was an aspiration. It wasn't a description of who we were at the time. It was like a mission statement. And how many of us as individuals go, well, I'd like to exercise more, I'd like to stop smoking, whatever it is, I'd like to read more, but we fall short. And America fell short. And remember, America didn't start until 1776. We didn't get our Constitution till 1780s. That's when we started right then to outlaw slavery. We ended the slave trade was ended in 1808. The founders all believed that it was going to go away, slavery as time went on. But the 3/5 compromise, which a lot of people don't understand what that was. A lot of people think it meant that the founders thought slaves were only worth 3/5 of a person. It's absolutely the opposite. The 3/5 compromise was the founders, their plan was to outlaw slavery because it was about representation. The South wanted their slaves represented to get people to get
congressional votes.
Congressional votes. And the North said, no, you can't count slaves. They're not free people. If you want more congressional votes, then you need to get rid of your slaves. So the whole point of the 3/5 compromise was
to encourage them to free the...
Yeah. And that was from the very beginning. So there were so many things put into place for the beginning of the Constitution. but kids aren't told that.
Well, and I think what's also important to recognize is that today we think about America. Back then, they really didn't. They thought about, I'm from Connecticut.
Yeah.
I'm from South Carolina. I'm from Georgia. I'm from New York.
Yes.
And it was more thought of, and I mean, we had the Articles of Confederation. This was a confederation of nations that we said, okay, that didn't work very well. Let's try this new thing called the Constitution. But I mean, that was still the cultural thing, is that these are individual republics, which is true. And that was one of the big issues of the Civil War, is in South Carolina, I think it was South Carolina, you had abolitionists coming in, and I mean, on one hand, you can appreciate that they're trying to free slaves, but on the other hand, you can say, okay, they're actively breaking the law in the state, and South Carolina's going, hey, wait a minute, we had an agreement in this confederation, in this union, that the individual states' laws will be respected, and the other states are not respecting our laws. We're out. Now, it's a moral quandary, because it's like, well, you got slaves and trying to free the slaves. But, I mean, it's the point that I'm trying to get at is to say, okay, at the founding, for one group of individuals that they call themselves the national representatives, to say, okay, we're all going to do the same thing. What's going to happen? I mean, these places all saw themselves as individual nations. And there was this compromise, because, I mean, if you look at people like Thomas Paine or Samuel Adams, their idea was end it now. End slavery now. It's immoral. I don't care what your reasoning is, or economic or social, whatever. It's immoral. Stop it. There was that end of the spectrum. And the middle spectrum was, well, look, we don't like it either, but we're going to lose this war, and we're not going to have anything if we can't all get on the same page. So it's this problem. We're going to have to deal with it in the future. Unfortunately, dealt with it with a civil war. But we just got to deal with slavery for now. Otherwise, we're not going to have a union, and we can't fight Britain, and none of it matters anyway. Right? So, to the point that you're saying, is that there was this push against slavery, and it's an aspiration to say, look, we've got this problem. We don't know how to deal with it at the moment, but we know it's wrong. We know it's bad. Minus a few people, right? Because I do think, I mean, it's not untrue to say there were heavy proponents of slavery in the South, because it benefited them. Slaves are great when I own the slaves, right? And so a literature and a culture came out defending slavery. Slave's good for the slave because they're not smart enough to know what to do, and we're taking care of it. That sort of crap, right? So, unfortunately, you got the other extreme end of the spectrum that defended slavery, and it was a wound that kept building and building and building, and finally caused a war. But I think we're still dancing around the same thing of going, it's not fair to say even that we're being hypocritical about slavery, because what we did were actions that led to getting rid of it.
Yes. And had we not made this compromise, and Georgia and Tennessee had all gone their separate way,
they could still be slave states.
Exactly.
Probably not today, but yeah.
But we, by keeping them in, compromising with them, and setting some limits, like the ending of the slave trade, that set the stage. We want things to happen instantly now.
Right.
We look at our phone. We want that information instantly.
We want that change instantly. Yeah.
Yeah. They change the information. That's just not how the world works. Slavery existed since the dawn of man, and had it not been for Western civilization, there would still be a lot of slaves now. They still exist in many parts of the world now.
Yeah. Well, and something funny just came to my mind. So John Locke, I was reading the Second Treatise of Government some time ago, and he's got a page on there on slavery.
Yeah.
And he's not against it. Remember, John Locke is like 1600 and something or other, right? And I'm reading this thing, and here's the argument that he gives, is that, so slavery is for, if you're in a situation where a person would have been executed or killed, war, criminal, whatever, and you choose not to, the society chooses, or the person chooses not to kill the person, that person then becomes a slave, because that person owes the person who could have killed them and didn't in their life. And I read the one page and went, oh, okay. And I kept reading, and I started reading the next page, and I said, wait a minute. Did I just nod and agree to the, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But I think what occurred to me, not at that moment, but as I thought about it later, is that was the thinking of the world. Mm-hmm. I came into your village. We conquered it. I could have killed you, but I didn't. So now you owe me your life. I think that's just like the base human nature of how we establish a pecking order, right? And it wasn't until more advanced civilizational ideas came along, like Christianity, looking at Rome, looking at all these slaves, going, maybe we shouldn't be conquering, murdering, raping, and pillaging and enslaving our neighbors, because that's bad. Like that's a new idea.
Yeah,
and it's part of the Western tradition. Yeah,
and that's what we're going to be talking about, is that this is how civilizations change. They went in, they conquered people, they took them over, they built their civilization, they were then conquered by somebody else. Our children are taught that Americans are colonists, or that Westerners are colonists, and that we've destroyed the world. That has been the way civilization has moved since the dawn of man.
Well, and the West is the first ones that said, well, let's do it a little differently.
Yes.
Let's not be so horribly brutal.
Yes.
About this. Yeah. I mean, compare the West to Genghis Khan, for example. Like. Yeah. Oh yeah, you know about that, right? Coming from China. How many Chinese people would there be now if Genghis Khan never came? Right? I mean, I've heard some estimates that, like, in where he conquered, they exterminated like 90% of the population.
Yeah.
90% by hand. I mean, it's not like they had nuclear bombs and machine guns or something. It's like, okay, we conquered it. Every soldier, you got to kill 50 people by 4 o'clock today. Kill them all. One by one. I mean, it's like when you read history or hear about history like that, you're like, oh, maybe I don't have it so bad here.
The brutality of civilization everywhere, because again, it goes back to the nature of man, has just been horrendous. And right now we have the luxury of living in a free nation with great prosperity, and so people can worry about things like, is everything exactly equal? Are you using the right pronouns with me? In other cultures, it's, can I survive this?
Can I eat today?
Yes.
Am I not going to be killed, raped, and murdered and enslaved today?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And kids need to understand that is the history of man. Mm-hmm. And but there's a great, glorious legacy that comes from it. Look what we ended up with. Mm-hmm. The freest, most prosperous nation on the face of the planet, and we've done so much good here. But where did that come from? We didn't make it up. We looked at history. We took what was good. We rejected what was bad, and we came up with an incredible plan.
Well, let's go back to the curriculum and mix this a little bit. So, where's the starting point in the curriculum? I don't know which person I'm looking to for an answer.
Dan.
Okay. Well, we're going to do a very quick journey through about 10,000 years.
Okay, so like pre-Sumeria.
Yes,
is where you're starting.
The nomadic people, what caused them to stop, how did that change? We're going to do just very quick introductions to Sumeria and Acadia and the Egyptians and all the different things that were going on at the same time. And it's kind of interesting, that it's not like you had Sumeria and then you had Babylonia and then you had the Greeks and then you had the Romans. They're all happening at the same time and borrowing from each other, conquering each other. And
I want you to see this little diagram. Sorry you can't see it on the screen. This is from the Evolution of Civilizations. He's got this little diagram here of like how, starting with the Neolithic garden cultures, if you don't know what that is, go look it up. But that leads into Mesopotamia, leads into Egypt, that leads into the Indic and the India round 1 and China round 1. He has India's and China's rounds 1 and 2 for civilization in here, and how they mixed. They led to next civilizations, and for example, he's got classical civilization, which would be the Greeks and Romans. That comes from Cretan civilization and Canaanite civilization. Both of those have influence from Mesopotamian civilization, and Cretan civilization has influence from Egyptian civilization. And this weaving map.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And there were great civilizations outside of Mesopotamia, and but we can't cover China, we can't cover India. We can respect them, but we're going to be focusing in on then is the Western civilization and how it Mesopotamia, Egypt, and then on to Greece and Rome. And then we're gonna, and she's got a copy of, I think it's right here. We're gonna, this is gonna be a very quick survey course, but we're gonna go from Greece and Rome. We're gonna go to the medieval times, to the Renaissance, and then the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and then tie it all together with this is what built America. And so that's our plan. And
At what point is there any point that you let off on that fast forward button? I mean, okay, you're starting at pre-Sumeria and you're fast forwarding. Is there some point that you slow down a little bit and say, okay, we're now on classical Greece. We've got we now have writings from people that we can get books of, right?
Yes.
You slow down a little bit at that point and say, okay, let's
absolutely
dive a little deeper in here.
Because the overriding point of this is how did this build into what we now know as America? So, yeah, we're going to talk about the Akkadians, we're going to talk about the Babylonians, but we'll spend a lot more time on Greece and Rome because so much of our heritage came from those great thinkers. We'll talk about the Renaissance, which, gave a chance for people to appreciate beauty. That's something that wasn't enjoyed throughout most of the world. It was about survival. It's about not being conquered. The focus on beauty and architecture, which is really, Lynn's thing. We're going to talk about that and how that influenced our country. So we're going to focus on the things, again, where did America get this? It's rule of law, it's equality, it's love for children and protection for them. That all came from certain civilizations, and that's where our focus is going to be. We're going to introduce people to kids to the names of these places, so that when they get them again later, they'll go, oh yeah, I remember we learned about the Assyrians. But our focus is going to be on the great civilizations that led to Western civilization, or led to American policies and stuff. So what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, so like Anne said, we have this fabulous curriculum to eventually tie to our country. Because there's so much we want to share with them. Just hearing you guys talk about slavery makes me think about some of the wonderful classic novels that can really put our kids into a different perspective, seeing what really happened.
And when you say classic novels, like what time frame are you talking about?
So let's say right before Civil War.
Okay.
I have a daughter. She's 12, and so she read Gone with the Wind. So when the school tried to teach slavery and how terribly the slaves were treated, she raised a question of, that is not what I understood from the history. The slaves were like a family. Because they're property of someone, naturally they contributed, like a family. And they were actually treated with care. They were taken care of.
I guess this depends on the owner. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, but it's really the northern, from the book anyway. So it's from the northern influence that they didn't understand the value of the slavery. They were the one actually were kind of mean to them. So I guess that was another aspect of classical learning we hope to introduce to our kids, maybe in a different camp or program, like these classical novels. They were true to history and they were true to human character, and they demonstrate a lot of good values and virtues that we no longer have today, that we no longer value today. So that's another thing that we encourage them on the side, because if you compare, I'm a little off track from this camp, but it's still in the theme of what we want to offer, program.
I mean, this is the conversation,
yeah.
the sort of conversation we have.
If you look at what's popular with kids reading right now versus what's been offered from the classical novels that's been appreciated, century after century, you can tell there's not just the words or the language. Obviously, we really appreciate the language and words, and the kids, they have to really think about a lot more of the content.
I'm about to make fun of Harry Potter when you're done.
It's not just from A to B. I mean, the process of getting from A to B really expands their thinking in a much deeper way, and expand their imagination, and really capture the value or the facts of what the history background, the society orders.
There's a lot to pull out.
Yeah,
and
and human
really
nature.
A lot you could extract from it.
And what's been valued, and how people deal with certain things, and what do you think about that moral? Makes them think so much more in complexity, and challenges them in so many different ways. So I no longer buy them trendy books. To me, their valuable time should be put into these classical literatures. I get the same rewarding feeling from the Chinese literature. A lot of time what I'm teaching them, it's just very simple poems that's, centuries and thousands of years ago. But the message behind it is so, to me, so valuable. They when you first read them, they might not seem like too much. Sometimes they talk about two people's relationship through a wartime. But the consistency and the dedication, the commitment they made to each other overcomes all these hardships that we no longer offer the kids, like the society no longer offer the kids to value these days.
Right.
They might be just one simple message, and one maybe just to some people just a simple love story. But it's so much more than that. And when my kids from my class, they grow older from the age that they did learn about this poem, they come back to me and say, why people try so hard to stay together? Because nowadays you could just easily abandon one relationship, move on to the next, because you put yourself in the center. Where at that time, people had a different centers that they respected and committed to. Those are, to me, are some real human characters that has evolved. And I hope that, from the classic literatures, that they retrieve back to that and really see what has been lacking in today's society, and what it's really, I think, built human the way we should be, with the good virtues and values. And again, it's those virtues and values build a better society. So anyway, so that's another aspect of classic learning we hope to eventually introduce the kids to as well, the classical literatures.
Great. Yeah. I will take this time now to make fun of Harry Potter, if you don't mind.
Perfect. Yes.
And I'm sorry, Harry Potter is what came to my mind. So you were comparing, like, for example, if I go to the library in a kids section today, what I'm going to find, right? To the sort of thing that you're describing. And I remember, I wasn't this huge Harry Potter fan, but I read them all. I mean, the seven. I know she wrote more stuff outside. I didn't read any of that stuff. But it's fun to read. And I mean, I'm not criticizing anybody for reading Harry Potter. And I mean, they're page turners. Like, you don't want to stop reading because you're just going and going and going. But I remember thinking this when I finished the seventh one. I'm like, what did I learn from that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, like you said, let me compare this to John Steinbeck, who was a card-carrying communist, by the way, but he wrote some good books. I read a book called Cannery Row. Have you guys read Cannery Row?
I've read. Yeah.
Okay. It's pretty short, and it's a very meandering story to it. But I remember one part of it. There's this takes place in the Great Depression, where in somewhere in California, right, where there's a lot of canneries,
Monterey
right,
area.
and there's these guys that are, I don't know if calling them homeless is the right word, but I mean they're kind of vagabonds, and this story about how these vagabonds handle themselves in the city. And at one point, they come across a car. And they're all driving around in this car, and the book is very clear that it says when you have a car, you got to make sure that you have a lot of reverse, because when you go up a hill, a lot of times a car doesn't have 30s, right? The car doesn't have the oomph to get up the hill, but if the reverse is strong, you can back it up and go up the hill in reverse. And I remember reading that, and I'm like, okay, it's interesting. Fast forward to some number of years. Again, I don't remember when I read the book, but I had this pizza delivery job in Vermont when I lived in Vermont for a year. And Vermont's pretty rural. I don't know if you know. And this is before everybody had phones, so I'm using a physical map to look up how to find where I'm delivering these pizzas, right? And so I had this car. It was a 1992 Saab 900. It was a stick shift, and it was this $500 car. Everything's falling apart on it, right? I mean, one thing after this is falling apart. And at some point, I lose second gear. So I'm driving around, I just rev it up in first gear, and then swip the third gear to try to get where I'm going. And I had this one delivery. I'm driving around in this piece of crap Saab, and the turn went straight 90-degree left and almost immediately a 90-degree right, and then it was this dirt hill that went up very sharp. And I had to go slow down to do this turn, so I had to go into first gear, but once I was in first gear trying to go up this hill, I could not get enough oomph in the car to keep it going in third gear. Mm-hmm. And it was pitch black at night, and I'm got this physical map. But I mean, is it close enough that I can get out and walk? I don't know. And I sat there thinking, I'm like, how am I going to get this pizza up here? And I remembered that book. And I turned my car around, put it in reverse, and I went straight up that hill. And now, I know we were talking about, okay, you read a book and there's these huge complex ideas that we could extrapolate and whatever, but I mean, even just the simple stuff of, here's something that pertains to reality.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I love how you put it.
Something that pertains. There is not a single thing in Harry Potter that I could have extracted like that. Not out of 7 books of 4,000 pages or whatever it was, not one thing could I have extracted like that.
Well, that spell in book 4. You can use that.
Oh, okay, right.
No, thank you guys for bringing that up, and because we're going to touch on, there's only so much you can do in a week, but we are going to be touching on literature, and when you look at, we'll be introducing kids to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey, and when you look at what did these people choose to write about it was about courage. It was
Odysseus is a jerk, by the way.
Yes,
I wrote a paper on that in college.
Well, he was, but it was an adventure story, and he was courageous, and yes, he was not a very nice man.
No,
but that's part of the world. But you think about the Greeks and Romans, the stories that they wrote, and going into more complex stuff. But the stories they wrote were about the tools that they needed, not just the information, but the values and the virtues that they needed in order to be successful. They needed strength and courage.
And deception. Achilles was supposed to be the strength and courage, and Odysseus was supposed to be the deception that the Greeks valued. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was part of their world. But then you think about what are our kids reading today? They're pulling all the good classic literature with complex ideas and characters and great vocabulary and fabulous sentences, and they're replacing it with victimization and angst. And this is what makes me unhappy, and this is why I'm not going to do this, and this is what my friends did to me. There's nothing to strive for. Right. No great
ideal.
Virtues. Yes. So we're going to be introducing that. So it's going to be a 12,000 romp through wars and slavery and conquering and dictators and but we're going to have fun, and they're going to learn what is valuable and what moves you forward. It's learning to reverse your car going up a hill, and even more than that.
Right. I'm going to get a little more nuanced here, if you guys don't mind. So, an argument that Carol Quigley makes in here, or I don't know if it's an argument, it's an observation, that Western civilization tends to grow as a moderation between extremes. And if I could, I'm not going to try to find it here. I've failed in my 2 attempts to do that so far, but one of the examples that he gives, I mean, you could say, okay, Marx is actually a product of Western civilization. Karl Marx's writings is a product of the Enlightenment, actually. And let's put Karl Marx on one hand, and let's put Thomas Jefferson on the other hand. I know he owned slaves. I'm gonna forget that for a second. Just looking at the ideals that he put forward, right? Which is like this very atomized, individual above everything sort of situation. Where so let's criticize Karl Marx here for a second, which is he was completely nuts and nothing made any sense. But he starts with a problem that really is a problem, which is what's the value of labor? And I think that's a very reasonable thing to address. But I mean, he goes completely cockeyed with it, which is to say, okay, well the problem is we have these oppressors, and then so the people who would labor, they need to rise up and conquer their oppressors, and then they'll be free. It's not like they'll turn into oppressors or anything, right? So we got that on one end, and then we got Thomas Jefferson on the other hand, where it's like, okay, everything's atomized and everybody is supposed to be their own self-thinking sovereign unit. It's like, well, that's cool, but if your country's invaded, how do you? If everybody's this individual sovereignized unit that they can say, okay, well, maybe I want to defend the place, or maybe I don't, whatever. Well, then how are you supposed to have a cohesive pushback against being invaded? So that's one extreme over here. Here's another extreme over here. What's the actual answer? Well, the answer's somewhere in the middle. And if you go back to even like the scholastic arguments in the Catholic scholastic tradition, Western civilization is, even go back to, fundamentally it goes back to, is it Aristotle or is it Plato? Is it Aristotle or is it Plato? Because, I would argue Marx is more Plato and, for example, Thomas Jefferson is more Aristotle. But we seem to move forward as a compromise between extremes. So I don't know if you've thought about it this way before, but when we're talking about these people, because, like I said, Karl Marx belongs on the list of Western philosophers. I use that term loosely to include him under the umbrella. But how are you going to teach, okay, as we're navigating through this, which of these ideas, we're not going to tell you what ideas are good or bad, but maybe you will. But what's the tool for determining if the ideas are good or bad?
Well, I would tend to say it's knowing your history. Mm-hmm. There's been good and bad ideas throughout history, but if you don't know it, you're going to focus in on what sounds the most flowery. And Marx appealed to a lot of people at that time. And
he still does.
Yes, he does, and he changed the course of history. So he is a very important historical figure. We're doing a week on Western civilization. He may get a mention, but what we want to do is really just introduce the kids to critical thinking and recognize that, again, as John Dos Passos says, get away from that self-centered thinking of now. This is how it is now. To be able to look at what's happened before and make good decisions moving forward. So. Recognizing that he is part of Western civilization, we have to own him and we have to own slavery. But that doesn't mean we have to let those things define who we are. We always strive to be better. The Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, was an aspiration, and we are still working at that. It's not a description of who we were at the time. So
I really want to just piggyback on that, because again, the history here, I think, is going to demonstrate to the kids what is just the concept and what is the actual result from it. As you know, so China followed Marxism, right? So we wanted to become this communist country. And the slogan they used was exactly the concept of, once we defeat these rich people and these people with authority and powerful people, we're going to give back the poor
everything
the
that
share.
they stole. Yeah.
And then history shown that never happened. In fact, now we all become this one layer. We don't have any more middle class anymore. And that's exactly the process I'm seeing happening right now. So when they defeat us to the bottom feeders and take away all the resources and scholars and all these thriving forces in society, then we have nothing to fight back with. We have to do what is it that they tell us to do. And they continue to indoctrinate that they're taking care of us, but actually they're taking away everything from us. Nobody ever got what they promised, what Mao promised before the Civil War. But many thousands and 10,000s of people joined his army thinking the Marxist idea was going to work. They were going to get what they get. But actually, what the communists took away, it's the logical order of society, the provided owners of the land were, kind of like slavery. They treated people really nice, because they are part of their profits, and it becomes the extended family. But all that was taken away just because, we've been taught that richness is bad, capitalism is bad. We all should rise at the same level, and we all share everything. But ultimately, everything belongs to the government.
There's nothing to share if nobody makes it. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that, the concept, I just got a question, the same thing from a PhD student who's learning about the Marxism. And he says, I heard you say that you grew up in the Cultural Revolution. Now, there are a lot of people, not marginal at all, in the young population. They really think Marxism is a good idea. But why do you have to say against it? So I kind of repeated what I just alliterated here.
Because I like food.
I mean, I grew up in with
Yeah.
rations, and we have very limited resources to even survive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember eating meat once a year on New Year Day. And that was how poor everything was. It was nothing like what Mao promised. And now over the years, when I come to the States, I learn all this disinformation that we were taught. All the natural disasters that never happened, and all these bad decisions because he was the one that made all the decisions. And we all suffer for it. So there is really no good reality follow the concept of communists in recent history. So hopefully that, again, history will demonstrate to the kids that concept is only ideal if it follows with reality.
Well, that leads me to think of another specific concept. I don't know if this is something that you'd be getting into. This is actually going to allude to a bit from the Center for Self-Governance class that we talked about, or that we were at, is I remember reading the Gulag Archipelago. I did an audiobook. And man, have you read the Gulag Archipelago? No.
Yes, I have.
That is a tough read.
Yeah.
I mean, to get through that, I mean, there were some times I was just like, I need to, oh my God.
Yeah, it was brutal.
I mean, just listening to like the individual stories of all this horrible stuff that happened to people. I mean, and when I say horrible, it's like torture, awful stuff that happened to people. Yeah. And the Gulag Archipelago is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's his story of this guy who lived in Soviet Russia and managed to make it through the gulags. And the stories that he saw, he was able to write them down, and he actually smuggled them out of the country in the 70s, I think it was. Yeah. And they were able to publish a book out of it. And one of the stories he had in there, I don't remember if he experienced this personally or if it was him repeating a story that he had heard from somebody else. But there was, after the communists took over, there was a lot of these trials, right? I'm not talking about the show trials. I'm just talking about, okay, I think they called it Article 58. That was the if you were like a political terrorist or something. I don't like Stalin, Article 58, sort of thing, right? And there was this tribunal where the accused criminals were getting filtered through so quickly that the guards were literally picking them up and running them into the room so the judge could go, guilty 10 years, guilty 5 years, guilty 20 years, and running them out because they had to process them so quickly. And the judge, or adjudicator, whatever they call them, right, made sort of mention of, our system is so great. In the West, they have countries that split the powers apart. They have the judiciary, and they have the executive, and they have the legislative, and it slows everything down. Our system is so great because it's so expedient for the party that we could just do things right away. And he goes on to this whole thing about this word expediency, right, that they used. But I think that's a point when it comes to addressing something like communism, and we're talking about principles. What principles are there to be understood is, regardless of, okay, this economic system is better, we organize things that way, whatever, the real key issue that's the foundation at the bottom, is how is the power split up?
Yet.
And communism is put all the power in one person or one small group of people.
Reality, it's true.
Right? Mm-hmm. And what's unique about the American, we'll call it experiment, is that no other country has split up the power like we have. Everything's thrown around. I mean, most people think, oh yeah, there's the president and then there's the Congress, right? Well, the president's only able to do so much, and Congress is split into two different houses, and then we have the states, and we've got the federal, and in the states we've got the three branches, and in those three branches they're split up, and then we got the county, and we got the city, and we got the school board, and even if you look at the executive at the county level, it's split up into 6 different groups, and everybody's got this power just all just spread out all over the place. And the whole idea behind communism is that's a terrible idea. We need to put all the power, remove all the boundaries of power, and put it in one spot, which goes back to Plato's Republic. That was his idea of, okay, how do we put all the power in one? So we've got the philosopher kings that create the law, that execute the law, and that judge the law, and everybody else who just has to deal with it. And I want to point that out, and I mean, again, I don't want to tell you what the teacher, like, are you going to teach this too? Are you going to teach this too? Yeah. We only have a week. Yeah. But I think this is, when it comes to understanding history and getting principles from history that make history exciting, when we say, okay, one of the main principles is, how is the power divided? Because everything else seems to flow from that. Mm-hmm. It's how is this power divided?
And that's one of the points of this camp is our kids are going to be able to answer that question. Where did we get the concept of separation of powers? Mm-hmm. They're going to know that, and it's important. And I want to build on a couple of things that you said. The efficiency of a communist, expediency of a communist country. That's why so many of our corporations and stuff are leaning that way. They like the idea of being able to make a quick decision and get people to do what they want. Because, they can be very efficient in saying, well, this is the policy we're going to have. They don't have to go through all that messy discussion and debate and voting and all that kind of stuff like we do. And we see what's happened over the last 100 years with that.
That efficiency means you die.
Exactly.
You die. Yeah.
That's right.
It's very efficient when you two are dead and not bugging me anymore. Right?
Yes. And it's, I win and you lose. That's what that kind of efficiency goes to. But I also want to build on your idea about the Gulag Archipelago. Mm-hmm. I read it about a year ago. And one of the things that really hit home with me was I had kind of thought that all the people there were dissidents, people that hadn't liked Stalin. And what I found out was that it was a slave system, that they would say, we want to build this project over here in this province in Russia.
So go arrest 100,000 people for anything. We don't care. We need the slaves.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was slavery, and nobody ever talks about it because communism is supposed to make everything equal.
Right.
That's not what it was.
Well, and let me go back to something else we talked about, which is kind of you don't really recognize the basic assumptions in your own civilization. Like the people criticizing Christianity are still taking a lot of Christian assumptions in their everyday life sort of thing, is that Russian civilization, quickly refers to it as Orthodox civilization, started with Vikings coming and conquering the Slavs from the north, and then from the south, the Orthodox religion came in, and one of the big emphases of the Orthodox religion is that your rulers are put there by God. Well, if you already have a society which is this 2-tier, I'm in charge and you do what I say and I can do whatever I want to you, and oh man, look at here's a religious backing of why what I'm doing is right. I mean, you get this fusion, and the Russian society, for most of its history, is that where we said, okay, well, how do we produce anything? Well, it's not, well, we're going to have a system of profit motive, and everybody gets a job, and we're going to create things like that, and we'll have manufacturing, and that wasn't it in Russia. It's serfdom and gulags for slaves, right? That goes back, and then if you look at it from this perspective, and you say, okay, the Soviet Revolution happens, the Communist Revolution happens, and everything changed, and everything was completely different, whatever, but you still end up with this 2-tier system where everything is done by slaves and gulags. So the faces changed. I would say the brutality increased, but the basic structure of the society didn't change. So you come in saying, we got these new ideas and we're going to change everything. Oh, really, are you? Right? And I have a feeling this is similar in China when the Communist Revolution comes around, right? Is that, okay, yeah, everything's totally different. You're not allowed to think for yourself anymore, and all the authorities are changing or whatever, but there's still basic assumptions from the culture that keep moving forward unquestioned.
I think it comes down to the true characters of a person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other day, my 12-year-old asked me a question because she realized throughout history, the modern history, many countries try to duplicate what we have as a government system, but none of them really survived. And she asked the question that, why is that, And so we talked about it, and she realized it's because of human nature. It's always going to be after greed, power, and whenever they have those, they don't remember to share like the way they're supposed to. So like how you described our government system, so many layers and different tiers because the power is supposed to come from the people, right? So then they have all these different orders. But eventually, even with the same constitution, the same system described on the paper, anywhere else, as long as there's nobody to check balance the government,
then things get really expedient.
Things get really efficient.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's another dimension. I'm really always really happy when they ask these questions, because these are something that you don't get taught in school, but it's something that through their understanding and comparing different, history or different countries and culture, they're curious. They start to think for themselves. And I know those are always a time as a teacher, I get really excited. Especially if they, through discussion among themselves, they come up with different hypothesis or ideas what that is, and make them to dip deeper, and just again going back to that critical thinking ability. So anyway, so this is definitely something Anne and I are very carefully trying to integrate in our curriculum as well.
So when's the next one, and how can people participate?
So our next one is in Renton, so that's on the 17th. The week of 17th of July. So we run for 5 days. We try to dedicate each day to a different civilization. And then in the end, we're hoping the parents will come and join us and see the reward of their learning. So we're going to put up a Victorian tea party to invite the parents and just have the kids run it, have them run the show and share what they've learned and put together programs to it's like an open house. So that's kind of our camp format. And then eventually when we get into a more regular school system, we use the same substance, but we keep the format. We change the format.
So are you going to try to get this into the school system or have it be parallel to the school system?
Okay, so I should make that very clear. Not the public school system. There's no way they probably will work with us.
They recognize that you're anathema to the very concept of what they're doing. Yes.
We're a hate group.
But we're thinking, because now, as you know, the population for homeschooling and church school are just skyrocketing. So we're hoping to make connections with those entities and see if we can incorporate this program into the school. But for the summer, we have the July 17th week and also the following week, the 24th. They're at two different locations, so we're having different experience of the enrollment. But that is what we are willing to do, if we have enough interest.
So if I have interest and I want to get a hold of you, how do I do that?
Okay, so we have a website. It's www.theclassicalscholars.com. It has all our information. And in fact, I'm so inspired by our conversation today. We're going to put on some of the ideas that we talk about here about history learning and these goals on our website. So hopefully that more parents can relate to what we're trying to do. Right now on our website, we have more about the information aspect of the camp, but we really should put the big idea behind it and our passion, what we're passionate about sharing in this program.
Yeah.
So.
What's it cost?
So for the Renton camp, it's $450 for 5 full days of camp, and that will probably include some really nice incentives for the kids to take home. A lot of it's their material from school. I don't want to put the school because that's a sensitive word for summertime. The kid says, I want a playtime. So we're going to be establishing like timelines and cursive booklets and notebooks that we hope that they will, use that as a souvenir, but really as a building block for their future learning. So they can start to, keep filling in the timeline that we'll help them establish. So things like that, to us, that's really, really a nice incentive for what we can give them.
Excellent.
And I would just like to comment, you've mentioned your daughter a couple times, and if you met her daughter, she's so smart and so sweet. And imagine being with a child that's curious like that. And we recognize that this camp is we're not going to change the public education system. We're not going to affect everybody. But these, dozen kids here, 2 dozen kids there, they're going to be the salt and light. And anybody that interacts with people like her daughter or kids that have come to this camp.
It's going to have an exponential effect.
Exactly. And so it's, we're kind of a remnant right now, people that want to teach truth and freedom to our children, but they're gonna share it with others. So I'm so inspired by what Lynn has done for years with her daughter. And I've introduced my granddaughter, who's about the same age, and just seeing them interact and seeing my granddaughter, who's been brought up in the public schools, seeing her see what was going on and go, whoa, this girl's smart and she's fun and I like this, and to see her want to be a part of that was so exciting to me, because my granddaughter's also smart, in case anybody sees this. Brilliant, by the way.
Yeah it really when those same young minds get together, and they have actually very similar interests. They all love history. They all love to read. So to just see them interacting with each other and really inspiring each other, it's exactly what we want to do with our program. It's about seeing them being this sovereignty self, right, and not just taking what we give them, but really take what we give them and make that their own, and inspiring their friends. I love to see them interact.
Teach them to be free thinkers. Introduce them to history, but teach them to be free thinkers so that they're being discerning, so that when they do, read that article or that book, or they're told something, they're going to go. Exactly.
Yeah. To get rid of this, I keep calling it intellectual and moral poverty. It's really abound at us right now. Yeah, we had to tear it one layer at a time and reveal them. They're very delightful, very just really, they like challenges. They really do. And when I ask my daughter, what do you think history served you the most? She says, it makes me look at what's happening in the recent years with a different light, because I don't just take what they tell me. I like to do my own research. I like to look at it from different perspective. I like to see how people are in action versus what they say. And she says that's what's happening pattern after pattern in history. And that's what we should, she didn't say those eloquent words, but her idea is she feel like the same pattern repeat itself in history. Haven't we learned already?
Yes.
How to go forward?
Well, Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. It is the same pattern over and over, and we're only going to break it if kids get the chance to experience it and understand it.
Absolutely. Was there any final thing that you guys wanted to say before we wrap this up?
No, just thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about this, and I hope people will hear it and recognize that. I hope that they will join the camp, and that they will work on introducing their own children to this kind of thing, because this is what's going to save our nation. It's not electing another politician who's going to be, do whatever he needs to do to get elected. It's making the people understand the truth.
Yeah. We're building from bottom up.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if anyone who are interested in joining us in terms of teaching our program, that is definitely a resource we're so eager to hear because we really like to expand this program, like I say, in different format, in different communities. So if you are someone who are interested just to find out more about our program and see how we can all work together, I would really appreciate it. And again, our website is theclassicalscholars.com. So just contact us. We love to hear from you.
Great.
Thank you. And it takes somebody, we all talk about what needs to be done, and it takes a mind that goes, this is something we can actually do, a change that we can make. And so I'm so grateful for Lynn for taking this idea that we all talk about and making it a reality.
Oh, thank you, Anne.
Well, we've got Anne Streit. Sorry, Anne Streit over here. Lynn Trinh. Rhymes. Thank you both for coming on the show. This has been an excellent conversation, and I'm excited about what you guys are doing, and I'm very curious to see how successful your summer camps are and how it grows.
Yeah, it is going to grow. That's the whole point. You start out small and you build. It's like a snowball. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dylan Moore at Irida TV, which you can find at irida.tv. We'll stick a dot right there. Go there, check out our stuff. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.